Horse invades supermarket in search of food. The reason touched everyone. The sun had barely risen when Mrs. Emily opened the doors of Good Value supermarket in the quiet town of New Hope. The aroma of fresh bread was already spreading through the air, mixing with the smell of fresh fruit that the employees were arranging on the counters. It was another ordinary day in this small town in the American Midwest, where everyone knew each other by name, and news traveled faster than the wind. While arranging the window display, Mrs. Emily observed the movement on the street. Shopkeepers were opening their stores, children were running to school, and old Mr. Tom was already sitting on his usual bench in the square, feeding the pigeons. The routine was comforting, almost predictable. However, on that Tuesday morning, something different hung in the air. Perhaps it was the wind stronger than usual, or the particularly blue sky. Mrs. Emily couldn't explain it, but she felt that day held a surprise. The doorbell chimed, announcing the first customer of the day. It was Sarah, a young veterinarian who had recently arrived in town. Her white coat contrasted with her red hair tied in an unpretentious bun. "Good morning, Mrs. Emily. How are you today?" Sarah greeted with a warm smile. "Ah, my dear, I'm fine. And you? Ready for another day taking care of our four-legged friends?" Mrs. Emily replied, returning the smile. Sarah nodded, picking up a shopping basket. Yes. Actually, I came to buy some apples and carrots. I have a special patient today." As Sarah chose the freshest fruits and vegetables, Mrs. Emily couldn't contain her curiosity. "A special patient, is it? Tell me more about that, my dear." The veterinarian hesitated for a moment, as if deciding whether to share the information. Finally, she yielded to the lady's kindness. "It's Champion, Mr. Johnson's horse from Happy Valley Ranch. He hasn't been eating well in the last few weeks, and I'm a bit worried." The horse's name caught Mrs. Emily's attention. Champion was famous in the region, known for his intelligence and loyalty to his owner. "Ah, Champion. Sorry to hear that. That horse is practically a legend around here. I hope he gets better soon." Sarah agreed, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. "I hope so too. I'll do my best to help him." As the two talked, more customers began to arrive at the supermarket. The growing buzz of voices and the noise of shopping carts filled the environment. Mrs. Emily said goodbye to Sarah and turned her attention to the other customers. The hours passed quietly. The coming and going of customers was constant, but nothing out of the ordinary. Around noon, when the movement decreased a bit due to lunchtime, Mrs. Emily decided to take a break. She entrusted the cash register to Julie, her longest-serving employee, and went to the back of the supermarket. She sat down in a plastic chair, unwrapping the sandwich she had brought from home. As she ate, her thoughts wandered to the conversation she had had with Sarah earlier. What could be happening to Champion? That horse was known for his strength and vitality. Was it just age advancing? Or was there something more serious happening at Happy Valley Ranch? Her thoughts were interrupted by a scream coming from the front of the supermarket. Alarmed, Mrs. Emily jumped up, dropping the rest of the sandwich. She ran towards the noise, her heart racing. When she reached the main area of the supermarket, her eyes widened at the scene unfolding before her. The automatic doors were open, and a huge brown horse was standing at the entrance, his eyes scanning the environment as if looking for something. "Oh my goodness!" exclaimed Mrs. Emily, immediately recognizing the animal. "It's Champion!" The horse, hearing his name, turned his head towards Mrs. Emily. His eyes, large and expressive, seemed to convey a mixture of desperation and determination. Before anyone could react, Champion took a step into the supermarket. Panic set in. Customers screamed and ran, trying to get away from the animal. Products fell off the shelves with the sudden movement of people. Mrs. Emily, paralyzed by surprise, could only watch as Champion advanced through the aisles. The horse moved with a strange combination of urgency and care. Despite the chaos around him, he seemed to have a clear objective. His eyes scanned the shelves, as if looking for something specific. Meanwhile, on the street, a small crowd was beginning to form. Curious onlookers gathered at the windows and at the entrance of the supermarket, trying to understand what was happening. The buzz grew, and soon the news that a horse had invaded Good Value supermarket was spreading through the town like wildfire. Mrs. Emily, recovering from the initial shock, tried to approach the animal. "Easy, Champion," she said in a low and soft voice. "What are you looking for, my dear?" As if answering the question, Champion abruptly stopped in front of the fruit and vegetable section. His muzzle approached the apples and carrots, the same ones Sarah had bought earlier. At that moment, Mrs. Emily had a realization. She remembered the conversation with the veterinarian, the concern about the horse's diet. But why would Champion come to the supermarket? What could be so urgent? While these questions swirled in her mind, Champion gently picked up some apples and carrots with his teeth. Careful not to damage the food, he turned towards the exit. The customers and employees, still stunned, made way. No one dared to stop the horse, which was now walking with dignity towards the street. Mrs. Emily followed him to the door, watching as he gained the sidewalk. Outside, the crowd parted, allowing Champion to pass. The animal, with its precious cargo of fruits and vegetables, began to trot towards the town exit, heading to Happy Valley Ranch. Mrs. Emily stood at the door of the supermarket, her heart still racing but now full of curiosity and concern. She knew this wasn't the end of the story. Somehow she sensed that the mystery behind Champion's actions was much bigger than anyone could imagine. As she watched the horse disappear on the horizon, Mrs. Emily made a decision. She needed to find out what was going on, and for that she would have to visit Happy Valley Ranch as soon as possible. The afternoon sun was already starting to lean on the horizon when Mrs. Emily closed the doors of Good Value Supermarket. The incident with Champion had left all customers and employees in a state of shock and excitement. Gossip was running wild through the town, each version more extravagant than the last. "Julie, dear," Mrs. Emily called her trusted employee, "can you take care of closing today? I need to resolve an urgent matter." Julie nodded, curious but too respectful to ask questions. Mrs. Emily grabbed her purse and the keys to her old Blue Beetle, determined to unravel the mystery behind Champion's actions. As she drove down the dirt road leading to Happy Valley Ranch, Mrs. Emily mentally reviewed the day's events. The horse's behavior was too intriguing to be ignored. There was something else going on. She could feel it in her bones. As she approached the ranch, a strange feeling began to take over her. The place seemed strangely quiet. There wasn't the usual sound of animals or the movement of workers. It was as if a cloak of sadness covered the property. Parking in front of the main house, Mrs. Emily noticed that the windows were closed and there was no sign of life. She got out of the car, her heart pounding in her chest. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing in the silence. "Is anyone home?" There was no answer. Worried, she walked to the barn, hoping to find someone. That's when she heard a soft neigh. Champion was there, standing at the entrance of the barn as if he had been waiting for her. "Hi, big guy," Mrs. Emily said softly, approaching carefully. The horse didn't move, his intelligent eyes fixed on her. "What's going on here, huh?" Champion neighed again and took a step to the side, as if inviting Mrs. Emily to enter the barn. Intrigued, she followed him. What she saw inside left her breathless. In the corner of the barn, on a pile of clean hay, was a baby, a girl of no more than 6 months, sleeping peacefully. Beside her were the apples and carrots that Champion had brought from the supermarket. "Oh my goodness!" Mrs. Emily exclaimed, running to the baby. The girl woke up at the sound, her big blue eyes opening curiously. She didn't cry, just looked at Mrs. Emily with surprising calmness. Champion approached, his muzzle gently touching the baby's face. The girl smiled, her little hands reaching for the horse with familiarity. It was evident that the two had a special bond. "But how?" Mrs. Emily murmured, trying to understand the situation. That's when she noticed a crumpled envelope attached to a nearby beam. With trembling hands, she picked it up and opened it. The letter inside, hastily written, told a heartbreaking story. It was from John, the ranch owner. He explained that his wife had died in childbirth and that he himself was very ill. With no close family and fearing for the future of his newborn daughter, John had entrusted the baby to the care of Champion, the most loyal animal he had ever known. "I know it sounds crazy," the letter said, "but Champion has always been more than just a horse. He has a heart of gold and an intelligence that goes beyond human understanding. If someone is reading this, it means Champion has managed to get help. Please take care of my little Emma, and if possible, don't separate her from Champion. They are family now." Tears streamed down Mrs. Emily's face as she finished reading. She looked at the baby, Emma, and at Champion, finally understanding the reason for the supermarket invasion. The horse was desperate to feed the child. "Oh, you crazy, wonderful old thing," Mrs. Emily said to Champion, stroking his neck. "You really are a hero, aren't you?" At that moment, the sound of a car approaching was heard. Mrs. Emily left the barn in time to see Sarah, the veterinarian, parking her jeep. "Mrs. Emily?" Sarah called, surprised. "What are you doing here?" "Oh, my dear," Mrs. Emily replied, her voice choked with emotion. "You won't believe what happened. Come, I need to show you something." As she guided Sarah to the barn, Mrs. Emily knew that life in New Hope was about to change drastically. The story of Champion and Emma was too extraordinary to remain a secret for long. Inside the barn, Sarah was speechless at the scene. "This is unbelievable," she whispered, watching Champion gently protecting the baby. "It's more than that," Mrs. Emily replied. "It's a miracle. And now we have to decide what to do next." The two women looked at each other, aware of the weight of the responsibility that had just fallen on their shoulders. The sun was setting on the horizon, casting golden shadows through the cracks in the barn. It was the end of an extraordinary day, but just the beginning of an even more incredible journey. Champion softly neighed, as if understanding the gravity of the moment. Emma, still lying on the hay, let out a cheerful giggle, oblivious to the drama surrounding her. And there in that dusty barn on the outskirts of New Hope, an unlikely family was beginning to form. Mrs. Emily took a deep breath, her mind already working on the next steps. There was much to be done, taking care of Emma, finding out John's whereabouts, dealing with the authorities. But looking at Champion, with his wise and determined eyes, she knew she wouldn't be alone in this mission. "Well," she finally said, picking Emma up in her arms, "I guess it's time to take this little lady home and figure out how we're going to explain all this to the town." Sarah nodded, a smile forming on her lips. It's going to be quite a story to tell. As they prepared to leave, Champion positioned himself beside them like a silent guardian. It was clear that he had no intention of letting Emma out of his sight. "All right, big guy," Mrs. Emily laughed, stroking the horse's muzzle. "You're coming too. After all, you're the hero of this story." And so, under the starry sky that was beginning to form, the most unusual group New Hope had ever seen left Happy Valley Ranch. A supermarket lady, a veterinarian, a baby, and a horse, united by fate and by an act of love that defied logic. The town awaited them, not knowing that it was about to be the stage for a story that would touch everyone's heart and forever change the meaning of family and devotion. The dawn in New Hope brought with it an unusual stir. News about the horse in the supermarket and subsequent events at Happy Valley Ranch had spread like wildfire. Groups of residents gathered at the corners, sharing theories and speculations about what was really happening. At the center of this storm was Mrs. Emily's house, a modest two-story building with a cozy porch. Since the night before, when she returned from the ranch with Emma, Sarah, and Champion, her residence had become the epicenter of all the town's curiosity. Inside the house, Mrs. Emily moved with the energy of someone half her age. She prepared bottles, changed diapers, and tried to keep Emma comfortable, all while dealing with incessant phone calls and knocks on the door from curious neighbors. "Sarah, dear," she called, balancing Emma in one arm while trying to close the living room curtain with the other. "Can you see if Champion is okay in the backyard? I'm afraid all this commotion is bothering him." The young veterinarian nodded, going out the back door. In the small backyard, Champion grazed peacefully, seemingly oblivious to the tumult his presence was causing. Seeing Sarah, he raised his head, his intelligent eyes fixed on her. "It's all right, big guy," Sarah reassured him, stroking his neck. "You did a great job taking care of Emma. Now it's our turn to take care of both of you." Back in the living room, Mrs. Emily was trying to calm another curious neighbor on the phone. "No, Mrs. Wilson, it's not true that the horse talked. That's absurd. Look, I have to hang up now. Yes, I promise to tell everything later." As soon as she hung up, the doorbell rang again. Mrs. Emily sighed, but before she could answer, Sarah intervened. "Let me handle this, Mrs. Emily. You need to rest a bit." Opening the door, Sarah found herself face to face with the town's mayor, August Green, a middle-aged man with a well-trimmed mustache and an impeccable suit. By his side was the social worker, Claire Roberts, a woman with a serious expression and a folder in hand. "Good morning," said the mayor, his tone grave. "We need to speak with Mrs. Emily. It's an urgent matter." Sarah hesitated for a moment, but Mrs. Emily, who had heard the voices, appeared behind her with Emma in her arms. "It's okay, dear. Please come in." The group gathered in the living room, a tense silence hanging in the air. It was Claire who spoke first, her voice professional but gentle. "Mrs. Emily, we understand that you have a child who isn't yours. We need to discuss the legal situation of this." Mrs. Emily held Emma tighter against her chest, a look of determination on her face. "This girl's name is Emma. She is the daughter of John, the owner of Happy Valley Ranch. And yes, I brought her here because she needed care." The mayor cleared his throat, uncomfortable. "We understand your good intention, Mrs. Emily, but there are procedures to be followed. We can't simply ignore—" His words were interrupted by a loud neigh coming from the backyard. Champion, as if sensing the tension, had approached the living room window. His muzzle pressed against the glass, eyes fixed on Emma. The scene left everyone silent for a moment. It was Sarah who broke the impasse. "Gentlemen, I know it looks like an unusual situation, but there's more to this story than it appears. Allow me to explain." In the minutes that followed, Sarah and Mrs. Emily told everything. John's letter, the state of the ranch, and the incredible bond between Champion and Emma. Claire took notes furiously while the mayor listened with an increasingly perplexed expression. "This is extraordinary," the mayor murmured when they finished. "But we still have to follow the law. The child needs to be registered, undergo medical exams, and we need to locate the father, if he's still—" Mrs. Emily gently interrupted him. "Mayor, I understand your position, but I ask that you consider Emma's well-being above all. She's been through so much in such a short time. We can't simply tear her away from this environment where she feels safe." Claire, who had been silent until then, finally spoke. Maybe we can reach a temporary agreement. Mrs. Emily, would you be willing to become Emma's temporary guardian while we investigate the situation and look for relatives?" A smile lit up Mrs. Emily's face. "Of course I would. I'll do whatever it takes to keep this child safe and happy." The mayor seemed relieved by the suggestion. "That could work. But what about the horse? We can't just leave him here in the middle of town." At that moment, as if to answer the question, Champion neighed again. Emma, hearing the sound, let out a cheerful laugh, stretching her little arms towards the window. Sarah smiled, an idea forming in her mind. What if we used the empty lot next to the veterinary clinic? We could turn it into a small pasture. That way Champion would be close to Emma, and I could monitor his health closely. The mayor pondered for a moment, then slowly nodded. That could work. We'd have to sort out some details, but yes, it could work. As the group discussed the next steps, Mrs. Emily looked out the window. Outside, the small crowd of onlookers had grown, but now, instead of worried or suspicious faces, she saw smiles and looks of admiration. The story of Champion and Emma was touching hearts. "You know," said Mrs. Emily, turning back to the group, "I think this story is bigger than all of us. It's about love, loyalty, and how sometimes families form in the most unexpected places." Claire smiled, closing her folder. "I agree, and I think New Hope just got a new tourist attraction." Everyone laughed, the tension finally dissipating. Outside, Champion neighed once more, as if in agreement. And Emma, safe in Mrs. Emily's arms, smiled, oblivious to the tumult her arrival had caused, but somehow sensing that she was exactly where she was meant to be. As the day progressed, the news spread. New Hope had become home to an extraordinary story of love and devotion. And while the practical details were being worked out, one thing was clear: life in the small town would never be the same again. The weeks that followed brought significant changes to New Hope. What started as an extraordinary event, a horse invading a supermarket, had transformed into a story that captured the imagination and hearts of everyone in town and beyond. The empty lot next to Sarah's veterinary clinic was quickly transformed into a small, cozy pasture for Champion. The residents came together in a community effort to build a comfortable stable and fence the area. Children from the local school painted the stable with vibrant colors and drawings of flowers and animals, giving a cheerful touch to the hero horse's new home. Mrs. Emily, now Emma's official temporary guardian, adapted her routine to care for the little one. Good Value Supermarket now had an improvised nursery in the back, where Emma spent part of the day, enchanting customers and employees alike. The baby's presence brought new energy to the establishment, with customers lining up not just to shop, but to catch a glimpse of the local little celebrity. Sarah, in turn, divided her time between the clinic and caring for Champion and Emma. She had become a kind of unofficial spokesperson for the unusual duo, always ready to explain to the curious the special bond between the horse and the baby. On a sunny Saturday morning, Sarah arrived at the clinic to find a small crowd gathered in front of Champion's pasture. Frowning, she approached, only to discover that the reason for the commotion was actually something wonderful. Champion was in the center of the pasture, and beside him, secure in a specially built playpen, was Emma. The baby, now almost 8 months old, was standing up, her little hands grasping the fence. And to the delight of all present, she was taking her first hesitant steps under Champion's watchful and protective gaze. "Look at that!" exclaimed an elderly lady, tears in her eyes. "It's as if he's encouraging her." Indeed, Champion seemed to be guiding Emma. He moved slowly beside the playpen, softly neighing each time the girl took a step. When Emma wobbled, the horse quickly positioned himself so she could lean against his sturdy body. Sarah watched the scene, amazed. It was further proof of the extraordinary bond between the two. She made a mental note to document this moment. It would certainly be of interest to the animal behavior studies she had been conducting. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Mrs. Emily was in a meeting with Mayor August and Claire, the social worker. The topic at hand was Emma's future and the impact her story was having on New Hope. "The interview requests keep coming in," said the mayor, running a hand through his graying hair. "Newspapers, magazines, even television channels. Everyone wants to know about the girl and the horse of New Hope." Claire nodded, flipping through a folder full of papers. "And that's not all. We've been receiving offers of help from all corners of the country. People wanting to donate for Emma and Champion's care. Companies offering sponsorships." Mrs. Emily listened to everything with a mixture of pride and concern. "It's wonderful to see how this story has touched so many people," she said. "But my priority is Emma's well-being. I don't want her to become some kind of circus attraction." The mayor leaned forward, his expression serious. "I understand your concern, Mrs. Emily, and I completely agree. But we also can't ignore the positive impact this is having on our town. Tourism has increased. New businesses are interested in setting up here. It's a unique opportunity for New Hope." Claire intervened, her voice soft but firm. "Maybe we can find a middle ground. Use this attention to create something positive and lasting, something that benefits not just Emma and Champion, but the entire community." It was at this moment that an idea began to form in Mrs. Emily's mind. She remembered a conversation she had had with Sarah about the therapeutic benefits of interaction between animals and people. "What if," she began slowly, the words forming as she spoke, "what if we created an animal-assisted therapy center here in New Hope? With Champion as our first resident, we could help children and adults with special needs, while educating people about the bond between humans and animals." The mayor's face lit up. "Mrs. Emily, that's brilliant. We could use part of the funds being offered to establish the center. This would create jobs, attract more visitors, and most importantly, make a real difference in people's lives." Claire smiled, making quick notes. "And we could ensure that Emma grows up in a protected environment, but still connected to the community. It's a solution that benefits everyone." As the three discussed the details of the plan on the other side of town, Emma was taking her first independent steps under Champion's proud gaze and the emotional applause of onlookers. New Hope was changing, evolving. An unlikely love story between a baby and a horse was transforming not just the town, but the lives of everyone who came into contact with it. And this was just the beginning. As the sun set on that Saturday, casting a golden glow over the town, there was a palpable feeling of expectation in the air. The future, once uncertain, now seemed full of possibilities. New Hope was living up to its name, bringing hope not just to Emma and Champion, but to everyone who heard their extraordinary story. Autumn arrived in New Hope, painting the trees with golden and reddish hues. The once quiet town now buzzed with renewed energy. The Animal-Assisted Therapy Center project was in full swing, transforming not only the urban landscape, but also the spirit of the community. At the heart of this transformation were Emma, now almost a year old, and Champion, her faithful equine protector. The unusual partnership between the girl and the horse continued to captivate hearts and inspire people from all corners of the country. On a crisp October morning, Mrs. Emily watched Emma playing in her backyard. The girl, who now walked confidently, chased butterflies with joyful laughter. Champion grazed peacefully nearby, always attentive to his protégé's movements. "Who would have thought, huh?" Mrs. Emily murmured to herself, a nostalgic smile on her lips. How life can change in the blink of an eye. Her moment of reflection was interrupted by Sarah's arrival, who wore a worried expression on her face. "Mrs. Emily," called the veterinarian, approaching quickly. "We have a problem." Mrs. Emily's smile disappeared. "What happened, dear?" Sarah took a deep breath before answering. "I received a call from the State Veterinary Board. They're questioning the legality of having Champion as part of the therapy program. They say we need special licenses, behavioral assessments, a series of bureaucracies that could delay the entire project." Mrs. Emily felt a weight in her stomach. The therapy center was a dream that the entire community had embraced. Delaying its opening would be a hard blow for many who eagerly awaited its services. "And there's more," Sarah continued, her voice lowering. "It seems there's a group of animal rights activists questioning whether it's ethical to keep Champion here. They argue that he should be in a horse sanctuary, not in a town." The two women fell silent for a moment, watching Emma play, oblivious to the adults' concerns. Champion, sensing the tension in the air, raised his head and looked directly at them, as if understanding the gravity of the situation. "We can't let this happen," Mrs. Emily finally said, her voice firm. "Champion isn't just a horse. He's family. And the good that he and Emma are doing for this community, that can't be measured by bureaucratic rules." Sarah nodded, a determined gleam in her eyes. "I agree. But we need to act fast. Maybe if we could scientifically demonstrate the positive impact Champion has." Before she could finish her thought, they were interrupted by a sharp cry. Emma had tripped over a protruding root and fallen face first onto the ground. Before either of the women could react, Champion was already by the girl's side. With surprising gentleness for an animal of his size, the horse used his muzzle to help Emma get up. The girl, instead of crying, clung to Champion's mane and laughed, as if it was all just a big game. Sarah quickly grabbed her phone, filming the interaction. "That's it," she exclaimed. "This is what we need. Real evidence of the bond between them and how Champion can help." In the days that followed, Mrs. Emily, Sarah, and the entire Future Therapy Center team worked tirelessly. They collected testimonials from residents, documented interactions between Champion and Emma, and even invited animal behavior experts to assess the situation. Mayor August, recognizing the project's importance to the town, used his influence to schedule a hearing with the State Veterinary Board. He passionately argued about how the therapy center was not just a local project, but a potential model for other towns. Claire, the social worker, compiled a detailed report on the psychological and emotional benefits that Champion's presence brought not only to Emma but to all the children who visited him. The New Hope community united like never before. Residents organized an online petition that quickly gained thousands of signatures. Local artists created murals depicting Emma and Champion's story, transforming the town into an open-air gallery that celebrated the love and connection between humans and animals. While the administrative battle unfolded, something unexpected happened. A group of researchers from a renowned university who had heard about the unique case of New Hope got in touch. They proposed a long-term study on the benefits of interaction between animals and developing children, using Emma and Champion as a central case study. This proposal was a turning point. With academic backing and the promise of research that could benefit fields such as child psychology and veterinary medicine, objections began to diminish. After weeks of negotiations, meetings, and presentations, the news everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. The State Veterinary Board had approved a special license for the therapy center, with Champion as its most illustrious resident. The news was received with tears of joy and emotional hugs. Mrs. Emily, holding Emma in her arms, walked up to Champion and stroked his neck. "Did you hear that, big guy?" she whispered. "You can stay. You both can stay." As if understanding every word, Champion softly neighed and nuzzled Emma's cheek, making the girl laugh cheerfully. That night, as the sun set over New Hope, there was a feeling of triumph in the air. The challenges had been overcome, and the future seemed brighter than ever. The extraordinary story of a girl and her protective horse would not only continue, but now had the potential to touch even more lives and, who knows, change the world in ways no one could have imagined. As the stars began to dot the sky, Mrs. Emily looked out the window and saw Champion sleeping standing up in the backyard, as he always did. And there, nestled against his legs, slept Emma, safe and happy. It was an image of pure trust and love, living proof that sometimes the strongest families are those that defy all expectations. Winter came to New Hope, bringing with it a thin layer of frost that covered the town's fields and rooftops. The Animal-Assisted Therapy Center, affectionately nicknamed Champion's Haven by the residents, was finally ready to open its doors. The center's inauguration was set for a sunny Saturday in July, coinciding with Emma's second birthday. The entire town was in a frenzy, preparing for the big event that promised to attract visitors from all over the country. On the morning of the inauguration, Mrs. Emily woke up before sunrise, a mix of anxiety and excitement making her heart beat faster. She headed to Emma's room where she found the girl already awake, playing quietly with a small stuffed horse. "Good morning, my love," Mrs. Emily whispered, picking Emma up. "Today is a big day, you know." Emma smiled, her eyes shining with an intelligence that sometimes surprised even Mrs. Emily. "Champy?" asked the girl, using the affectionate nickname she had given Champion. "Yes, darling. We're going to see Champy and many other friends today." As they prepared for the day, Mrs. Emily couldn't help but reflect on how her life had changed in the past 2 years. From a simple supermarket owner, she had become the guardian of a special child and a central figure in a project that promised to transform lives. At Champion's Haven, Sarah had been on duty since early morning, checking every detail one last time. The center was a breathtaking sight, a complex of modern and welcoming buildings surrounded by carefully planned green areas. There were spaces for individual and group therapy, trails for equine therapy, and even a small therapeutic zoo with rescued animals. And of course, at the heart of it all was Champion's stable, a spacious and comfortable structure that opened onto a wide pasture. The horse was already awake, as if sensing the importance of the day. As the morning progressed, the town began to wake up. Streets that would normally be quiet on a Saturday morning now buzzed with activity. Residents hung welcome banners, merchants prepared food stalls and souvenirs, and children ran excitedly, many of them wearing T-shirts with Champion and Emma's image. By 10 o'clock, a crowd had already formed at the gates of Champion's Haven. Journalists from all over the country jostled, cameras at the ready, waiting to capture the historic moment. Among the crowd, familiar faces stood out. Mayor August, nervously adjusting his tie, Claire, the social worker, with a proud smile, and dozens of residents who had closely followed Emma and Champion's journey. Finally, the moment arrived. Mrs. Emily, with Emma in her arms, walked to the main gate. Beside her, to everyone's surprise and delight, walked Champion, without any kind of rein or halter. The horse moved with an almost regal dignity, as if fully understanding the importance of the moment. Mayor August approached with large golden scissors, offering them to Mrs. Emily. "I think this honor belongs to the three of you," he said with an emotional smile. With Emma holding one side of the scissors and Mrs. Emily the other, they cut the ribbon together. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, while Champion neighed, as if giving his own approval. The doors opened and the public began to enter, marveling at every detail of the center. Volunteer guides conducted tours, explaining the different programs and therapies that would be offered. In a special area, families who had already signed up for the first programs eagerly waited to meet the therapists and the animals. In the midst of all the excitement, a touching moment captured everyone's attention. A girl in a wheelchair approached Champion timidly. For an instant, everyone held their breath, watching. The horse gently lowered his head, allowing the girl to pet him. The smile that lit up the child's face at that moment was living proof of the transformative power the center promised. As the day progressed, inspiring stories began to form. An autistic boy who had never spoken uttered his first word upon seeing a rabbit. An elderly man with Alzheimer's smiled and hummed a song from his youth while petting a cat. And Emma, to everyone's delight, conducted her own tour, proudly introducing her friend Champion to everyone she met. As evening fell, when most of the visitors had already left, Mrs. Emily found a moment of quietude. Sitting on a bench near Champion's pasture, with Emma asleep in her lap, she watched the sunset paint the sky in golden and pink hues. Sarah joined her, exhausted, but with a gleam of satisfaction in her eyes. "It was a success beyond our expectations," she said softly, so as not to wake Emma. Mrs. Emily nodded, tears of happiness shining in her eyes. "You know, Sarah, when all this started, I was so afraid. Afraid of not being capable, afraid of failing Emma, afraid that everything would go wrong. But look at this," she gestured to the center around them. "Look at what we managed to create." Champion approached, as if sensing he was being mentioned. He gently nuzzled Emma's cheek, making the girl smile in her sleep. "It wasn't just us," Sarah replied, stroking Champion's neck. "It was the whole town. It was every person who believed in this unlikely story of love and hope." The two women fell silent for a moment, absorbing the peace of the evening and the magnitude of what they had accomplished. Champion's Haven was more than a therapy center. It was a testament to the power of love, compassion, and community. As the first stars began to dot the sky, Mrs. Emily knew that this wasn't an ending, but a new beginning. Emma and Champion's journey was far from over. In fact, it was just starting to unfold, promising to touch even more lives and spread hope for many years to come. And there, in that perfect moment, with Emma's warmth in her arms and Champion's faithful presence by her side, Mrs. Emily felt a deep gratitude for every challenge, every tear, every smile that brought them here, for this unlikely and wonderful family that fate had given her, and for the certainty that, no matter what the future held, they would face it together, with love and courage. 5 years passed since the inauguration of Champion's Haven. New Hope, once a quiet Midwestern town, was now nationally known as a model of innovation in animal-assisted therapies and social inclusion. On a sunny spring morning, Mrs. Emily walked through the center's gardens, proudly observing the movement of families, therapists, and animals. Champion's Haven had grown beyond her most optimistic expectations, expanding to accommodate more species of animals and an even greater variety of therapeutic programs. Emma, now 7 years old, ran ahead, her laughter echoing through the air. She had become an extraordinary child, compassionate, intelligent, and with a natural gift for connecting with animals and people. Her origin story, far from being a burden, had become her greatest strength. "Grandma, come see," Emma called, waving excitedly to Mrs. Emily. She was standing next to a new mural at the entrance of the center, a vibrant work of art that portrayed New Hope's journey over the past years. Mrs. Emily approached, her heart filling with emotion as she saw the images. There was Champion, majestic as ever, next to a baby Emma. There were scenes from the center's inauguration, touching moments of successful therapies and smiling faces of countless people whose lives had been transformed. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" said a familiar voice behind them. Sarah joined them, her eyes gleaming with pride. Over the past few years, she had become one of the leading researchers in the field of animal-assisted therapy, her work at Champion's Haven being studied and replicated across the country. "It's more than beautiful," Mrs. Emily replied, her voice choked with emotion. "It's our story, the story of all of us." At that moment, a familiar neigh echoed through the air. Champion, now an elderly horse but still strong and noble, was approaching. Even after all these years, the bond between him and Emma remained unshakable. The girl ran to hug the horse's neck, whispering words of affection in his ear. "You know," said Sarah, observing the scene with a smile, "when I think about everything that's happened, sometimes I can hardly believe it. Remember that day at the supermarket? Who could have imagined we'd end up here?" Mrs. Emily nodded, vividly remembering the day that changed everything. Life has a funny way of surprising us, doesn't it? Sometimes the greatest miracles come from the most unexpected places. As they talked, they noticed a group of visitors approaching. It was a delegation from a neighboring town, interested in learning more about Champion's Haven's model to replicate it in their own community. Emma, noticing the visitors, naturally assumed the role of guide. With surprising confidence for her age, she began to tell the story of the center, of Champion, and how an entire community came together for a greater cause. Mrs. Emily watched with pride, amazed at her adopted granddaughter's eloquence and passion. Emma had inherited not only the love for animals, but also a deep sense of responsibility and desire to make a difference in the world. As the day progressed, Champion's Haven pulsed with life and purpose. In every corner there were stories of overcoming and hope. A teenager with depression found comfort in the affection of a rescued dog. A child with cerebral palsy took her first steps with the help of equine therapy. A group of elderly people rediscovered joy through interaction with rabbits and cats. At the end of the afternoon, as the sun began to set, Mrs. Emily, Emma, and Sarah gathered in Champion's pasture for a moment of reflection. The old horse grazed peacefully near them, his presence a constant reminder of how it all began. "Grandma," said Emma, her voice serious, "do you think we can one day help all the people and animals in the world?" Mrs. Emily smiled, touched by the innocence and ambition of the question. "Oh, my love, maybe we can't help the whole world alone. But what we've done here, what you and Champion started, this will spread. Like ripples in a pond, you know. Each person who leaves here transformed carries a bit of this magic with them." Sarah agreed, adding, "And don't forget, Emma, that every small act of kindness, every connection we make, all of this contributes to a better world. You two," she said, looking at Emma and Champion, "taught us that in the most beautiful way possible." As the sky turned pink and orange, reflecting on Champion's lustrous coat, the day's visitors began to leave. Many stopped to thank, some with tears in their eyes, others with radiant smiles. Each carried with them a spark of hope, a little piece of the miracle that had been born in New Hope. Emma snuggled in Mrs. Emily's arms, watching the stars that began to dot the sky. "You know something, Grandma?" she said softly. "I think I understood what you meant. We don't need to save the whole world at once. We just need to start with one heart at a time." Mrs. Emily kissed the top of Emma's head, her heart overflowing with love and gratitude. "Exactly, my love. And that's what we'll continue to do. One day at a time, one heart at a time." Champion approached, gently nuzzling Emma's shoulder. It was as if he too understood the depth of the moment, the beauty of the legacy they had created together. And there, under the starry sky of New Hope, surrounded by the fruit of their love and dedication, they knew that this was not an end, but a continuous beginning. The story of Emma and Champion, of a community united by compassion, would continue to inspire and transform lives for many generations to come. For in the end, they realized, the greatest miracle of all was not just what they had built, but the love that united them, a love that transcended species, defied expectations, and proved day after day that the strongest bonds are those forged by the heart. And so with hope in their hearts and stars in their eyes, they walked together back home, ready for the next chapter of their extraordinary journey. A journey that began with a horse in a supermarket and transformed into a legacy of love that would touch the entire world, one heart at a time. As the years passed, Champion's Haven continued to grow and evolve. What had started as a local miracle had blossomed into a nationwide phenomenon, inspiring similar centers across the country. Emma, now a teenager, had become an integral part of the center's operations, her natural affinity with animals, and her extraordinary story making her a beacon of hope for many. On a crisp autumn morning, as New Hope prepared to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Champion's Haven, Mrs. Emily sat on her porch, a warm cup of tea in her hands. She watched as the town bustled with activity, decorating streets and preparing for the grand celebration. Her heart swelled with pride as she reflected on the journey that had led them here. The sound of hooves on pavement drew her attention. Emma, now 15, was riding Champion down the street. The horse, despite his advanced age, still moved with grace and dignity. The sight of them together, the unbreakable bond between girl and horse still as strong as ever, brought tears to Mrs. Emily's eyes. "Good morning, Grandma," Emma called out cheerfully as they approached. She dismounted with ease, her movements fluid and practiced. Champion nickered softly, nuzzling Emma's shoulder. "Good morning, my dears," Mrs. Emily replied, setting down her tea and standing to greet them. "Are you ready for the big day?" Emma's eyes sparkled with excitement. "More than ready, we've got so many surprises planned. You won't believe what we've managed to organize." As they chatted, Sarah's car pulled up in front of the house. The veterinarian, now a renowned expert in animal-assisted therapy, stepped out with a broad smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Sarah said, approaching the group. "I just wanted to do one last check on our star before the festivities begin." While Sarah examined Champion, Mrs. Emily and Emma sat on the porch steps, watching the town come to life. New Hope had changed dramatically over the past decade. What was once a quiet, unremarkable town had become a vibrant community known for its compassion and innovation. "You know," Emma said thoughtfully, Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if Champion hadn't come to the supermarket that day. It's hard to imagine a different path. Mrs. Emily wrapped an arm around her granddaughter's shoulders. Life has a funny way of working out, doesn't it? Who would have thought that a horse looking for food would lead to all of this? Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mayor August, now in his second term and as enthusiastic about Champion's Haven as ever. "Ladies," he greeted warmly, "I hope you're ready for today. We're expecting quite a turnout. News crews from all over the country are already setting up in the town square." As they discussed the day's events, more familiar faces began to appear. Claire, the social worker who had been with them from the beginning, arrived with a group of children from the local orphanage. These children, once shy and withdrawn, now laughed and played, their lives transformed by their experiences at Champion's Haven. The celebration kicked off with a parade through the town centre. Champion, adorned with flowers and ribbons, led the procession with Emma on his back. Behind them came a menagerie of animals from the centre: therapy dogs, cats, rabbits, and even a few miniature horses. The townspeople lined the streets, cheering and waving. At Champion's Haven, the festivities were in full swing. Booths showcasing different therapy programs dotted the grounds. Visitors could try their hand at grooming therapy animals, participate in art therapy sessions, or watch demonstrations of equine-assisted therapy. In a quiet corner of the center, a special exhibit had been set up. It told the story of Champion and Emma, from that fateful day in the supermarket to the present. Photos, news clippings, and personal mementos chronicled their journey. Many visitors paused here, wiping away tears as they read about the extraordinary bond between a girl and her horse. As the day wore on, Mrs. Emily found herself overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and support. People she had never met approached her, sharing stories of how Champion's Haven had changed their lives or the lives of their loved ones. One woman, holding the hand of a young boy, stopped Mrs. Emily with tears in her eyes. "I just wanted to thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "My son, Tommy, he didn't speak for years. The doctors said he might never talk. But after just a few sessions here working with the animals, well, he hasn't stopped talking since." Tommy, shy but smiling, looked up at Mrs. Emily. "Thank you for the horses," he said softly. Moments like these were scattered throughout the day, each one a testament to the profound impact of Champion's Haven. Mrs. Emily felt her heart could burst with joy and gratitude. As evening approached, everyone gathered in the main arena for the culmination of the day's events. Emma, standing beside Champion, addressed the crowd. Her voice, clear and confident, carried across the hushed audience. 10 years ago, a miracle happened in our little town," she began. "A horse walked into a supermarket, and in doing so, he walked into our hearts. That horse, my dear friend Champion, didn't just change my life. He changed all of our lives." Emma went on to speak about the power of love, the importance of community, and the healing that comes from connecting with animals. As she talked, Mrs. Emily couldn't help but marvel at the poised young woman her granddaughter had become. "But this celebration isn't just about looking back," Emma continued. "It's about looking forward. Today we're not just celebrating 10 years of Champion's Haven, we're launching our next big project." A murmur of excitement rippled through the crowd. Emma smiled, pausing for effect before making her announcement. "Thanks to the generosity of donors from across the country, and with the support of our wonderful community, we're going to be opening 5 new Champion's Haven centers in different states over the next 2 years. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Mrs. Emily felt her knees go weak with surprise and joy. Sarah steadied her, grinning from ear to ear. But that's not all," Emma said once the noise had died down. "We're also establishing the Champion Scholarship Fund. This fund will provide education and training for people who want to work in animal-assisted therapy, ensuring that the legacy of Champion's Haven continues for generations to come." As Emma concluded her speech, fireworks burst in the sky above, painting the night with brilliant colors. Champion, unfazed by the noise, stood tall and proud beside his human companion. Later that night, as the celebration wound down, Mrs. Emily found herself back on her porch. Emma sat beside her, leaning her head on her grandmother's shoulder. Champion grazed peacefully in the front yard, occasionally lifting his head to check on his family. "I'm so proud of you, Emma," Mrs. Emily said softly. "You've taken this miracle we were given and turned it into something even more beautiful than I could have imagined." Emma smiled, her eyes shining in the moonlight. I couldn't have done it without you, Grandma. Without all of you. Champion may have started this journey, but it's the love and support of our community that's kept it going. As they sat in comfortable silence, Mrs. Emily reflected on the incredible journey they had been on, from a moment of chaos in a supermarket to a nationwide movement of healing and hope. It was more than she could have ever dreamed of. You know, Emma said thoughtfully, I've been thinking about writing a book, about Champion, about us, about everything that's happened. Do you think people would want to read it? Mrs. Emily chuckled softly. Oh, my dear, I think people would love to read it. Your story, our story, it gives people hope. It shows them that miracles can happen, that love can overcome any obstacle. Emma nodded, her mind already spinning with ideas for her book. I think I'll start tomorrow, she said decisively. As the night grew late and Emma headed off to bed, Mrs. Emily remained on the porch. Champion ambled over, resting his large head gently in her lap. She stroked his muzzle, marveling at the softness of his coat, even after all these years. Oh, Champion, she whispered, look at what you started. Who would have thought that a hungry horse could change the world? Champion nickered softly, as if in agreement, and as Mrs. Emily sat there under the starry sky, with the gentle sounds of new hope settling into night around her, she felt a profound sense of peace and purpose. The journey that had begun 10 years ago was far from over. In fact, it felt like they were standing on the brink of a new adventure. With Emma's passion, Champion's unwavering spirit, and the love of their community behind them, Mrs. Emily knew that the best was yet to come. As she finally stood to go inside, Mrs. Emily took one last look at the town she loved, the town that had been transformed by an extraordinary act of love. She smiled, her heart full of gratitude and hope for the future. Good night, Champion, she said softly. And thank you for everything. The horse lifted his head, meeting her gaze with those wise, kind eyes. In that moment, Mrs. Emily felt the same connection, the same sense of wonder and possibility that she had felt on that fateful day in the supermarket. And she knew with absolute certainty that as long as there was love in the world, miracles would continue to happen. With that thought warming her heart, Mrs. Emily headed inside, ready to rest and prepare for whatever new adventures tomorrow might bring. The story of Champion's Haven, of Emma and Champion, of a community united by compassion, would continue to unfold, touching hearts and changing lives for many years to come. As dawn broke over New Hope the next morning, the town was still buzzing with the excitement of the previous day's celebration. The streets, though quieter now, bore the remnants of the festivities, colorful banners fluttering in the early morning breeze and the occasional sparkle of confetti catching the first rays of sunlight. Mrs. Emily woke early, as was her habit. She made her way downstairs, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the house. As she stepped onto the porch, steaming mug in hand, she was greeted by an unexpected sight. Emma was already up, sitting cross-legged on the grass in Champion's pasture. The old horse stood nearby, his head lowered as if in deep conversation with the girl. Emma had a notebook in her lap and was writing furiously, pausing occasionally to look up at Champion or to gaze thoughtfully into the distance. Mrs. Emily smiled to herself, realizing that Emma had wasted no time in starting her book project. She watched silently, not wanting to interrupt this moment of inspiration. After a while, Emma noticed her grandmother and waved enthusiastically. "Grandma! I've been up since dawn. The ideas just keep coming." Mrs. Emily chuckled, making her way over to the pasture. "I can see that, dear. Would you like some breakfast?" Emma nodded eagerly, closing her notebook. "Yes, please. I'm starving." She stood up, giving Champion a quick pat before joining her grandmother. As they walked back to the house, Emma chatted excitedly about her writing plans. "I want to start from the very beginning, Grandma. Can you tell me again about the day Champion came to the supermarket? I want to get every detail right." Over a hearty breakfast of pancakes and fresh fruit, Mrs. Emily recounted the story once more, smiling as she remembered the shock and wonder of that fateful day. Emma listened intently, jotting down notes between bites of food. "You know," Mrs. Emily said thoughtfully, "there are so many people who could contribute to this story. Maybe you should think about interviewing some of them for your book." Emma's eyes lit up at the suggestion. "That's a great idea. I could talk to Mayor August and Sarah and Claire. Oh, and maybe some of the people who've been helped by Champions Haven over the years. As they cleared the breakfast dishes, a knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Sarah stood on the porch, a concerned look on her face. "Good morning," she said, her tone serious. "I hope I'm not interrupting, but we have a situation at the Haven. I think you both should come." Alarmed, Mrs. Emily and Emma quickly followed Sarah to her car. As they drove, Sarah explained the problem. "We received a call early this morning from a nearby animal shelter. They're overcrowded and facing budget cuts. If they can't find homes for at least 20 animals by the end of the week, they'll have to, well, you know." Emma gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "They can't. We have to do something." Mrs. Emily nodded grimly. "What are our options, Sarah?" The veterinarian sighed. "That's what we need to figure out. We're already at capacity at Champions Haven, but I can't bear the thought of those animals being put down." As they pulled into the parking lot of Champions Haven, they could see a group of staff members and volunteers gathered near the main building, deep in discussion. Mayor August was there, looking harried. "Ah, Emily, Emma, Sarah. Good, you're here. We need to come up with a plan, and fast." For the next hour, ideas were tossed back and forth. Could they temporarily house some of the animals in the town's community center? Could they quickly organize an adoption drive? What about reaching out to other shelters in neighboring towns? As the adults debated, Emma sat quietly, her brow furrowed in concentration. Suddenly she spoke up. "I have an idea." All eyes turned to her. Emma took a deep breath and began to explain her plan. "What if we turn this into a community event? We could set up tents here at Champions Haven, bring the animals from the shelter, and have a big adoption fair. But not just that. We could also use it as a chance to educate people about responsible pet ownership and the importance of animal rescue." She continued, her words coming faster as her excitement grew. "We could have food stalls and games and maybe even a small concert. People could sponsor an animal if they can't adopt. And we could live stream the whole thing on social media to reach even more people." There was a moment of stunned silence. Then Mayor August let out a hearty laugh. "By George, I think she's got it. Emma, my dear, you're a genius." The energy in the group shifted immediately. People began to build on Emma's idea, suggesting local businesses that might sponsor the event, musicians who might perform, and ways to quickly spread the word. Mrs. Emily watched with pride as Emma confidently answered questions and elaborated on her plan. In that moment, she saw not just the little girl she had raised, but a natural leader coming into her own. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. The entire town rallied around the cause, determined to make Emma's vision a reality. Local businesses donated supplies and food, high school students volunteered to help set up, and the local radio station ran hourly announcements about the event. Champion, sensing the excitement, seemed more energetic than he had been in years. He pranced around his pasture, nickering encouragingly at the volunteers as they worked. On the day of the event, dubbed New Hope for Paws, the grounds of Champions Haven were transformed. Colorful tents dotted the landscape, each one housing animals eager for a new home. The air was filled with music, laughter, and the occasional bark or meow. Emma, wearing a t-shirt with New Hope for Paws emblazoned across the front, was everywhere at once. She guided visitors to the animal tents, answered questions about adoption procedures, and even gave impromptu tours of Champions Haven to interested families. Mrs. Emily, manning a booth selling homemade treats, with all proceeds going to the animal shelter, watched her granddaughter with a mixture of pride and awe. She remembered the tiny baby she had first held in her arms and marveled at the compassionate, capable young woman Emma had become. As the day wore on, the adoption board began to fill up with names. Families left with wagging tails and purring bundles, their faces alight with the joy of new companionship. Even those who couldn't adopt were opening their wallets to sponsor animals or make donations. By late afternoon, a hush fell over the crowd as Emma took to the small stage that had been set up. Champion stood beside her as always, a steady presence at her side. "Ladies and gentlemen," Emma began, her voice clear and strong, "I want to thank you all for coming out today and showing your support. When we started this morning, we had a goal of finding homes for 20 animals. Well, I'm thrilled to announce that as of right now, we've not only met that goal, we've more than doubled it. 43 animals have found their forever homes today. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Emma waited for the noise to die down before continuing. But that's not all. Thanks to your generous donations and sponsorships, we've raised enough money to keep the shelter running for another 6 months, giving them time to secure more permanent funding. More cheers followed this announcement. Emma's smile was radiant as she looked out over the sea of happy faces. "I want to say something else, if I may," she said, her tone becoming more serious. "What we've done here today is wonderful, but it's just the beginning. There are still so many animals out there who need our help, who need a chance at a loving home. So I want to challenge all of you, and myself, to keep this momentum going. Let's make every day a new Hope for Paws Day. Let's continue to spread compassion and love, not just for animals, but for each other." As Emma concluded her speech, Mrs. Emily felt tears welling up in her eyes. She looked around and saw that she wasn't alone. Many in the crowd were wiping away tears or hugging their neighbors. The event wound down as the sun began to set, but the atmosphere remained jubilant. Volunteers began the task of cleaning up, their spirits high despite their exhaustion. Later that evening, as Mrs. Emily sat on the porch with Emma and Champion, she reflected on the day's events. "You know, Emma," she said softly, "when Champion first came into our lives, I thought the miracle was how he brought us together, how he helped create Champion's Haven. But watching you today, I realized something." Emma looked at her curiously. "What's that, Grandma?" Mrs. Emily smiled, reaching out to take Emma's hand. "The real miracle isn't just what Champion did. It's what he inspired in you, in all of us. The compassion, the drive to help others, the ability to bring a community together for a good cause. That's the true miracle, and it's one that will keep on giving for years to come." Emma nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She leaned her head on her grandmother's shoulder, one hand absently stroking Champion's mane. "I couldn't have done any of it without you, Grandma," she said. "You and Champion, you've taught me so much about love and kindness and never giving up." As the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, the three of them sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The events of the day had been a powerful reminder of the impact one small act of kindness could have, how it could ripple outwards and touch countless lives. Mrs. Emily knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever new adventures awaited them, they would face them together, with love, compassion, and the unbreakable bond that had been forged that day in a supermarket so many years ago. As summer turned to fall, and fall gave way to winter, life in New Hope settled into a new rhythm. The success of the New Hope for Paws event had sparked a renewed sense of community spirit, and its effects were visible throughout the town. The local animal shelter, once struggling and overlooked, had become a point of pride for the community. Volunteers, inspired by Emma's passion, signed up in droves to help care for the animals and assist with adoptions. The shelter's walls, once drab and institutional, were now covered in colorful murals painted by local artists, depicting happy animals in loving homes. At Champion's Haven, the new scholarship program was in full swing. Young people from all over the country applied for the chance to learn about animal-assisted therapy and to be part of the legacy that Champion and Emma had started. The center hummed with energy as seasoned therapists mentored eager students, and animals both old and new formed bonds with those they helped heal. Emma, now 16, divided her time between her studies, her work at Champion's Haven, and her book project. She had taken to rising before dawn, spending quiet mornings with Champion as she wrote, the old horse a steady presence at her side. One chilly December morning, as snowflakes drifted lazily from a grey sky, Emma burst into the kitchen where Mrs. Emily was preparing breakfast. "Grandma," she exclaimed, her cheeks flushed with excitement and cold, "I've finished it, the book is done." Mrs. Emily turned from the stove, her face lighting up with a smile. "Oh, sweetheart, that's wonderful. Come, sit down and tell me all about it." As they shared a breakfast of warm oatmeal and cinnamon-spiced apples, Emma excitedly outlined the structure of her book. She had decided to tell the story chronologically, starting with Champion's dramatic entrance into the supermarket and ending with the New Hope for Paws event. "But it's not just our story," Emma explained, her eyes shining. "I've included interviews with so many people. Mayor August, Sarah, Claire, and lots of the people who've been helped by Champion's Haven over the years. It's like a tapestry of all the lives that have been touched by what happened that day. Mrs. Emily listened, her heart swelling with pride. "It sounds beautiful, Emma. I can't wait to read it." Emma's excitement was tempered by a touch of nervousness. Do you think people will want to read it, that it might help inspire others?" Mrs. Emily reached across the table to squeeze her granddaughter's hand. "My dear, I have no doubt that your book will touch many hearts. The story of Champions Haven is one of hope, love, and the power of community. That's something the world always needs more of." Over the next few months, Emma worked with a local publisher to refine and polish her manuscript. The entire town buzzed with anticipation for the book's release. Finally, on a warm spring day, Champion's Heart, How a Horse Changed a Town hit the shelves. The local bookstore hosted a launch party, and it seemed like all of New Hope turned out for the event. Emma, looking both nervous and excited, read an excerpt from the book to the packed store. As she read, Mrs. Emily looked around at the faces in the crowd. There were tears in many eyes and smiles on every face. She saw the same emotion reflected there that she felt in her own heart, a mixture of pride, love, and gratitude for the extraordinary journey they had all shared. After the reading, as Emma signed copies of her book, a surprise visitor arrived. A tall, distinguished-looking man in a suit made his way through the crowd, stopping in front of Emma's table. "Miss Emma," he said, extending his hand, "I'm David Thompson from Horizon Publishing in New York. I just finished reading an advanced copy of your book, and I have to say I was deeply moved." Emma shook his hand, her eyes wide with surprise. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I'm so glad you enjoyed it." The publisher smiled warmly. "More than enjoyed it, my dear. I think your story has the potential to inspire people far beyond New Hope. I'd like to discuss the possibility of a national release, if you're interested." The bookstore erupted in cheers as Emma, overcome with emotion, nodded enthusiastically. Mrs. Emily made her way to her granddaughter's side, enveloping her in a tight hug. "Oh, Grandma," Emma whispered, her voice choked with happy tears. "Can you believe it? Champion's story, our story. It's going to reach so many more people." Mrs. Emily held Emma close, her own eyes glistening. "I can believe it, my dear. Your story, Champion's story, it's one of love and hope. And that's something the whole world needs." As the excitement of the day wound down, Emma, Mrs. Emily, and Sarah made their way to Champion's pasture. The old horse greeted them with a soft nicker, seeming to sense the joy of the occasion. Emma wrapped her arms around Champion's neck, pressing her cheek against his soft coat. "We did it, old friend," she murmured. "We're going to help even more people now." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, the small group stood together in comfortable silence. Each was lost in their own thoughts, reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. Mrs. Emily looked at Emma, this extraordinary young woman who had grown from the tiny baby she had first held in her arms. She thought of Champion, the remarkable horse who had started it all with one brave act. And she thought of all the lives that had been touched, all the hearts that had been healed, because of the love and compassion that had blossomed from that unlikely beginning. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of family and the promise of a bright future, Mrs. Emily felt a profound sense of peace and gratitude. The story of Champion's Haven was far from over. In fact, it felt like they were standing on the threshold of a new chapter, one that would reach farther and touch more lives than they had ever imagined possible. As darkness fell and the first stars began to twinkle in the sky, Mrs. Emily made a silent wish. She wished for the spirit of love and hope that had transformed their little town to spread far and wide, touching hearts and changing lives across the world. And somehow, as Champion nickered softly and Emma's hand found hers, Mrs. Emily knew that her wish would come true. For in the end, love always finds a way to multiply, to grow, to heal. And the miracle that had begun with a horse in a supermarket would continue to work its magic, one heart at a time, for many years to come. As the seasons changed and years passed, the impact of Emma's book, Champion's Heart, How a Horse Changed a Town, reached far beyond the borders of New Hope. The story of Champion, Emma, and their extraordinary journey touched hearts across the nation and soon, around the world. Letters poured in from readers everywhere, sharing how the book had inspired them to make positive changes in their own communities. Animal shelters reported increased adoption rates and volunteering. Schools incorporated the book into their curriculum, using it to teach lessons about compassion, community service, and the human-animal bond. Emma, now in her early 20s, found herself traveling frequently, giving talks at conferences, schools, and community centers. She spoke passionately about the power of animal-assisted therapy and the importance of community action. Wherever she went, she carried with her the spirit of New Hope and the lessons she had learned from Champion. Back in New Hope, Champion's Haven continued to thrive under the capable management of Sarah and a team of dedicated staff and volunteers. The center had expanded, now offering a wider range of programs and serving as a training ground for animal-assisted therapy professionals from around the country. Champion, now well into his senior years, had officially retired from active therapy work. He spent his days grazing peacefully in his pasture, receiving visits from admirers and enjoying the quiet company of the other retired therapy animals. Despite his advanced age, his eyes still held that same intelligent, gentle spark that had captured hearts so many years ago. Mrs. Emily, her hair now completely silver but her spirit as vibrant as ever, remained a beloved figure in New Hope. She had taken on the role of storyteller in residence at Champion's Haven, delighting visitors with tales of the early days and the many miracles, both big and small, that had occurred over the years. One warm summer evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over New Hope, a special gathering was taking place at Champion's Haven to celebrate its 20th anniversary. The event brought together people from all walks of life who had been touched by the center's work over the years. Emma, now a respected author and advocate for animal-assisted therapy, gave a moving speech about the journey that began with a horse in a supermarket. She spoke of the power of compassion, the strength of community, and the enduring bond between humans and animals. Mrs. Emily, now in her 80s but still sharp as ever, sat in the front row, her eyes glistening with tears of joy and pride. Beside her, in a specially designed enclosure, lay Champion. Though very old now, the horse still held his head high, his eyes bright as he watched the proceedings. As Emma concluded her speech, she made a surprise announcement. A new wing of Champion's Haven would be opening, dedicated to researching and developing new methods of animal-assisted therapy. It would be named the Champion and Emily Wing in honor of the horse that started it all and the woman who had the courage to believe in a miracle. The crowd erupted in applause, and Mrs. Emily was helped to the stage, where she and Emma shared a warm embrace. Champion nickered softly from his enclosure, as if adding his approval. As the celebration continued into the evening, with music, laughter, and shared memories, Mrs. Emily found a quiet moment to reflect. She thought about the extraordinary journey that had begun with a desperate horse and a supermarket, and marveled at how far they had come. The legacy of Champion's Haven had spread far beyond their small town, touching lives across the world. It had shown that love, compassion, and the bond between humans and animals could create miracles and change lives in ways no one could have imagined. As the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Mrs. Emily smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace and fulfillment. The story of Champion, Emma, and New Hope would continue to inspire generations to come, a testament to the power of love, the strength of community, and the extraordinary impact that can come from one small act of kindness.